I met my wife at a drag strip, and she still loves me and loved me enough to marry me in spite of the fact that she met me at a drag strip. I was working as the security director for a television show called Pink's All Out. You might catch it at 3 a.m. on Speed TV if you're really up late, and I recommend that you don't watch it. Go watch QVC. You'll be smarter after watching QVC than spending a few minutes watching Pink's All Out. But the crux of that, and the point is that, yes, she saw it. She had the wisdom to see through that, to love me, and to get to the next major hurdle in our relationship, which was the day that I called her and said, we were still dating at the time, and said, I'm going to go to Canada for a few days, and I'm going to go hang out at the library of a dead priest with my best friend and my Greek professor for a few days. And I thought, if this relationship can stand that much of a nerd factor, I'm in, I'm good. And she sat back and had a few questions and wanted to know a little bit more. But at the end of the day, she was really supportive of that. And so I did, and I was able to take that time and go. And for those of you who've been here with us from the beginning of Reunion, you might remember about a year ago when Brian preached through a thin little book called In the Name of Jesus. Some of you may even have addressed it in your house churches. In the Name of Jesus is a small little book written by a man named Henri Nouwen. And Henri Nouwen was, in the height of his career, a pretty renowned theologian and philosopher and professor. He taught at Notre Dame, taught at Yale, taught at Harvard. And he came to understand through his life of teaching and his life in academia that there had to be more than what he was experiencing in these arguments and in the laying out of systematic theologies in classrooms. And he found himself to be empty and really depressed because he had no meaning in what he was doing. And so he left that world of academia and stepped right into a life of service. And the life of service that he stepped in through a number of experiments and through a number of years and traveling the globe because of the resources that he had through his time in academia, stepped into a community called L'Arche in Toronto. It's actually based out of Trosly, France, but the community that he stepped in was called Daybreak, and it was in Toronto. And it was that place where we went and took a few days of retreat. And it's a really cool place to go. You can actually go and stay in the library or stay in the house where Henry lived, and his library is there all around you. So this world-renowned professor with his personal library and the books that had been inscribed to him by his friends and other famous academics from across the globe and throughout history sit in this library, and you're free to just peruse and sit and read and maintain a code of silence and just absorb the truth of what's there. And we could spend days talking about the truths that Henry taught and the things that he learned through his life and working with handicapped people after he left academia. And those are all really good things, but it's not really where we want to go this morning. What I want to do this morning is take a quick look to begin our series on vignettes. Maybe some of you saw the email that Brian had sent out earlier in the week about wrapping up the series of Flickering and talking about vignettes. And looking at vignettes and thinking about vignettes as portraits within portraits, or movies within movies, or scenes within scenes that are small, and yet, even though they don't carry the full weight of the plot, they carry a very pointed and important and often deep meaning behind them. And one of the things that I learned during my time there in Toronto was about how to read Scripture a little bit differently, how to look at Scripture and stories a little bit differently. And it was based out of a book that I had already owned. And I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people who goes and buys books because sometimes they look really cool and they might look good on my shelf, but I don't always get around to reading them. And I had bought a book called Return of the Prodigal Son by Henri Nouwen several years previous and had placed it on my shelf with all my others, and I had never read it. But I took it with me on this journey, and I took the time to sit and read it. It's very short. You can read it in a day. And I read through it, and it's about how Henry had one day stumbled into the office of a coworker and seen a portrait by Rembrandt hanging on the wall. Obviously, it was a print, not the original, but the portrait was the prodigal son. And it shows in all the artistry that Rembrandt can bring, the picture of that we know from from the Gospels of the prodigal son, coming back to his father and kneeling before his father and asking for forgiveness. And also in the picture, we see the older brother standing there kind of glowering down over him. And there are other servants in the background of the picture and of the portrait. And as you look at it, you're able to see the true depth of the scriptural story drawn out in this painting. And what had happened was Henry saw the painting on his co-worker's office and began to ask questions, and he began really a couple of year-long quests of pursuing it. The original hangs in St. Petersburg, Russia. Catherine the Great had purchased it at one point, and it still hangs there today. So he wasn't able to see that in that moment. And I don't know if you've ever had a chance to sit in front of a true masterpiece of art. There are few things as striking as good art. And I don't want to be an art snob, but I'm going to be an art snob. I've spent some time in the Art Institute in Chicago, and because of what I knew of this story, was actually able to sit in front of a Rembrandt. And it's not the one that we speak of, it's one called The Prince. But to sit in front of that and to look and to realize as you look at the painting, how much mastery goes into creating emotion on a piece of canvas with clumps of oil, and to begin to take all that in, and there's no other way to describe it really than to have been there and to see it and to own it. But what we get to with the crux of Henry's story is that he did eventually make it to Russia to see this painting. And what I learned during my time in Toronto and reading this book is that we want to sometimes stop and take a little bit different look at Scripture. And instead of reading it to read it, or reading it to parse it exegetically, or to read it to break it down and to see, well, let's see what systematic portion of theology this Scripture fits in, sometimes we just need to stop and we need to look at it and we need to taste it. And we need to feel the flavor of it roll around in our mouths. And we need to look at the painting, and we need to not just look at the story and say, this is what happened, but we need to look into the eyes of the person involved in that painting and stare at them and pull the emotion out of what it might have felt like to be in that moment and at that time in that place. And that is what he had learned from the time that he spent over the years with this painting called The Prodigal Son. That, I think, is a little bit of what we want to talk about as we talk about vignettes. Because we're taking bigger picture, big plot pieces, and as you know, we're running up into Easter now, and as we run up into Easter, we realize that we step into what we call Passion Week. Passion Week being that short stretch of time, that short week between when Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and he comes back into the city, and then the things that happen throughout the course of that week that lead us up to Friday, the Friday that Jesus is crucified and dies. And over the next couple of weeks, Brian's going to walk through some of those daily occurrences as we get closer to the end of Passion Week. And what we find ourselves with today is a little bit of a transitional story in the midst of that. Jesus has ended his formal ministry. He's come to an end. And he had been in Jerusalem, and he had been teaching, and he had raised a lot of questions and raised a lot of eyebrows in the Pharisaical community because he had just finished claiming to be God. If you read through John chapter 10, Jesus goes on extensively, basically claiming to be the Son of God, claiming to be divine, and they didn't like it. And this is where we read for the first time in John that they are planning to kill him. They didn't like it. We are plotting. We're going to arrest him and figure out how to get rid of him. We need to silence this man because he's rocking the establishment. And not only is he rocking the establishment within the faith community, but he's rocking it politically as well. Because what's happening is the Pharisees have got kind of an agreement under the table with Rome, because Jerusalem is under Roman control, and Rome says, we're going to control you politically, and you Pharisees can control everything on the religious side, and we won't bother you as long as you don't raise too many questions, and as long as you don't cause problems. Well, Jesus comes in now claiming to be the King of the Jews, and he's claiming to be God, and he's claiming to be divine. And the Pharisees are trying to quench that because they don't want it to come back to Rome, that there's some disagreement, that there's some rancor in their ranks, and they don't want anything to disturb the status quo, which will cause Rome to take their power from them and say, never mind, we're gonna run the whole thing. Because they know that politically and from a military standpoint, they can't compete. They can't stand up against Rome. And so what they're trying to do is not only maintain their own modicum of power over the small faith community, but they're trying to keep Rome out, and they're scared. So we come to the end of John chapter 10, and we enter this strange transitional phase, and I want to do a couple of things, and I want to pretend that we're sitting in front of your computer with Google Maps up or Google Earth, and you've got your mouse in front of you, and you can run the little scroll bar back and forth, and you can blow up the map to really big, or you can get right up close and you can look at the roof of your own house. We're going to jump back and forth a few times this morning as we talk about this vignette. What I'd like to do is take a nice close look at the story before we begin, at the portrait that we're going to look at the portrait that we're going to paint, that we can look at closely, where we can look into eyes, and we can pull out emotion, and we can look at the depth of the painting. It looks like this. From John chapter 12, beginning with verse 1. 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man that he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, "That perfume was worth a year's wages, and it should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor, because he was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." That's the picture we're going to paint. That scene. But first we need to back up a little bit. We said that at the close of chapter 10, Jesus had just left Jerusalem because the Pharisees were threatening to arrest him. They were trying to figure out a way to arrest him. And we begin here in chapter 12, but we need to take a look at what happens in there in the middle. And what we see is that Jesus, after those threats came from Jerusalem, he actually disappeared. We've never really talked, I don't remember ever growing up hearing in Sunday school lessons about Jesus hiding. We read about 40 days he spent in the desert praying and going and getting to know, praying and fasting and becoming closer with the Father and the things, and we're marking that as his formal beginning to ministry. But we don't ever really talk about Jesus going into hiding, but it's pretty clear here in John chapter 11 that Jesus fled to the desert, and he went to a town called, to a small town called Ephraim, which is out at the far end, almost to the edge of the wilderness. And he spent time there. And it says that the crowds were looking for him and they were trying to find him and they couldn't figure out where he was. And we think that some time has passed because at some point in this, he gets word from his friends that his friend Lazarus, who lives in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha, is very ill. And time passes a little bit more and the disciples are trying to get Jesus to go, and Jesus is kind of dragging his feet for a little bit. And they get word again that Lazarus has died. And Jesus already knew that Lazarus had died, and he tells us that. But now he packs everybody up, and they go, and Jesus comes back into the town of Bethany, and we all know the story. He comes to the tomb, and Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days behind the stone, and he wants him to roll the stone away, and Martha says, "You can't. He's already been in there for 4 days. The stench is going to be unbearable." And Jesus says, "Roll the stone away." And he gets angry because people keep coming to him and saying, "If only you had been here, he wouldn't have died. If only you had been here, he wouldn't have died. If only you had been here, he wouldn't have died." And there's a lot that we can get into and look at that we're not going to touch on this morning about how Jesus may have been setting himself up to demonstrate the fact that he had mastery over death. But the point is, Jesus was getting frustrated, visibly frustrated in the text because people kept coming to him and saying, "If only you had been here." And finally, Jesus says, "Roll the stone away." And we know from the kids' stories in the back and days of flannel graph board things when we were kids that the stone rolled away and Jesus said, "Lazarus, you come out." And all of a sudden, Lazarus comes out. And we keep on reading and we just kind of gloss over the fact that Jesus just raised someone from the dead and the full significance of that, because we're coming up onto Passion Week and we're coming up onto Jesus leaving again and going back to Ephraim and hiding, and we don't really have a good time frame on how long it is, but it's probably a couple of weeks that he's gone and he's out there, and all of a sudden it's time for Passover again. And what had happened the last time Jesus was in Jerusalem for Passover? Well, he had to run because they were looking for ways to arrest him, and he'd caused a huge stir by claiming that he was God. And so now there's a buzz starting in Jerusalem again. It's almost time for Passover again. And there's a buzz and there's a tremor of gossip, and people are talking and they're wondering if he's going to come back. Nobody's seen him for a while. They'd heard of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and when that happened, crowds rushed out to Bethany to see if they could find him, but Jesus was gone. He'd gone back into hiding. But now it's almost time for Passover. And suddenly, 6 days before Passover, we see it in chapter 12, Jesus reappears in Bethany. Bethany is a small town, not too far from Jerusalem, less than a day's walk away. So he's basically come back to the suburbs before he's going to head downtown for the main event. Jesus comes into Bethany, and we find ourselves with this scene now that's a little bit strange that we're painting a picture of. We find ourselves with a scene, and if we were going to set up the painting and we had the big canvas in front of us, there are a couple of players involved. The first is the setting itself. They're dining. It's a meal that's been prepared in Jesus' honor. So Jesus is probably at the head of the table. And around the table sit his disciples, 11 plus 1, and maybe they're sitting on either side of the table. And the text also tells us that Lazarus was there, the man that Jesus raised from the dead. How awkward is that? He was dead and now he's alive, and yet we're all sitting together at this meal, and in one corner in the back of the room is Martha. And if you read through the Gospels, there's a lot of examples of Martha being a servant, and there's books been written about how Martha had a servant's heart and what she did. And then the text here in John 12 tells us that Martha was in the back corner. She was serving like she usually did. And somewhere else in the room, we find Judas sitting around the table somewhere, and I can picture him sitting back in his chair, feet on the table. At this point, nobody knew that he was going to betray Jesus. No one knew what his future held. But I have a feeling that at some point, the other disciples had begun to distrust him a little bit. If he was truly the thief that John describes him to be, then there may have been some division there. And as the other disciples sat around the table and were clamoring for Jesus' attention and asking questions, involved and engaged in that constant competition that they seemed to have over who was going to sit closest to Jesus and who was going to be the favorite and who was going to be the leader, that Judas is kind of sitting back just watching everything, maybe picking his teeth with a toothpick, feet crossed on the table, just watching, biding his time. And John writes, and he tells us the story that gathered outside of the house, crowds came because they wanted to see Lazarus. They'd heard the stories of how Lazarus had been raised from the dead, and as they heard that Jesus had come back into Bethany, they made that quick half-day walk out to Bethany because they wanted to see him. They came from Jerusalem because they wanted to see what was going to happen. Wherever Jesus had gone, drama had followed, and people were flocking to that, both because of his teaching and their devotion to his teaching. But the text doesn't say that they were necessarily followers. They were just crowds, people who came maybe just to see the show, to see the spectacle. And so they're gathered around the outside of this house in the way that I envision it from the text, and maybe they're peering in windows, and maybe if it's an open air house or an open air setting like what would have been common in a gallery back then they're standing around outside, maybe on the hillsides, peering in, and they're watching, waiting to see what happens. And so you've got this beautiful setting of Jesus at the head of a table, and you've got all the players involved that go into this painting. You've got all the players involved that go into this scene that we're looking at this morning, that we're trying to dig a little bit deeper into, and there are 3 players that come to light. The text shows us who they are. The first is Jesus sitting at the table. And there's a little bit of a strange encounter here, a little bit of a strange interaction between Jesus and Judas. And while we obviously are going to get to Mary and what she does, I want to touch just for a second on this interaction between Jesus and Judas, because it's almost a role reversal. As Mary comes out and she brings out this very expensive pot of perfume. Some texts tell us it would have been worth about a year's wages at the time. Very expensive. And she breaks it open and she pours it on Jesus' feet. Judas is suddenly aghast. What are you doing? That should have been sold and the money given to the poor. And John offers his own commentary in there because John would have been there, and John would have been traveling with Judas at this time. And that's kind of what leads us to believe that maybe the disciples had started to distrust Judas a little bit. By the way, John writes that verse. He says that Judas reprimanded Mary, said that this should have been given to the poor. But John's own little underlying comment there is that, of course, he was a thief and he stole the money and he probably wanted to use it for himself. But I can kind of see some of the others maybe siding with Judas a little bit. It's really easy to be pragmatic and practical, especially in the world that we live in. made everything ultra efficient and ultra practical. That's the way that we live our lives. We stuff so much activity and stuff in our daily lives in 2014. I don't think that without the tools that we've developed, we could possibly hope to do the amount of stuff that we do now that you couldn't have been done 50 years ago. Human beings weren't efficient enough to get it done. And so I kind of transfer myself back into the text with that mindset, and I see myself sitting around the table now, and I put myself in that role, not of Judas, but of one of the other disciples, watching this scene unfold and sitting back and maybe trying to figure out where I stand with Jesus. And I hear Judas say, that should have been sold for the poor. That would be the practical thing to do. And maybe, just maybe for a second, hear myself start to sit up and go, yeah. And all of a sudden we hear Jesus reprimand him and say no. And say something that's completely unlike what we would be used to hearing Jesus say, which is, the poor will be with you always. Isn't it Jesus who's been the champion for the poor from the very beginning? Isn't it Jesus who told the rich young ruler to sell everything he had and give it to the poor? It's kind of a turning of the table, and it's an odd interaction based on what we know about Judas and on what we know about, based on what we know about Jesus. And so we've got our picture, and we've got all these players surrounding the scene, and we've got Jesus and Judas and Mary in the forefront, and all of a sudden, all we're left with is this odd interaction between Jesus and Judas and Mary, probably sitting on the floor with what would amount to a $40,000 or $50,000 bottle of perfume, breaking it open on Jesus' feet and wiping his feet with her hair. And all of a sudden, my portrait just got really, really strange. Because no matter how much you want to talk about the other disciples and how much you want to talk about the crowd and even the odd interaction between Jesus and Judas, Mary and her place on that floor, spilling out thousands of dollars of perfume on Jesus' feet and wiping his feet with her hair, that image commands center stage in our portrait. There's not really any other way to get around it. And sometimes when you take a look at a text and you break it down to begin to be able to preach about it, you realize that there's a lot more in that text than what you can realistically cover in one session together. And so you address those things, and some things, they don't get glossed over or skipped. You just realize that you have one point to a narrative that you would like to try to make in that moment. And so you break it down and you say, there's also other things here that we can take a look at. But with this text, there's no way that you can skip over Mary laying on that floor at Jesus' feet. She is the center point of this text, and everything that we look at begins and ends with her in this vignette. There is a point in Mary's action that is going to make everybody stop again. Outside of just Judas asking about, shouldn't this be sold to the poor? Because what I find myself doing then is sitting back down in the seat of one of those disciples at the table and watching what's happening, going on right in front of me. And as I'm watching and I hear Judas say from the background, shouldn't this be sold to the poor? And I find myself starting to agree, and I hear Jesus reprimand him. Then all of a sudden a question pops into my mind, because Jesus says what? He says, leave her alone. The poor will be with you always, but I will not. And the question that pops into my mind as I look at that scene and I listen to Jesus' words is, wait a second, what does she know that we don't then? If Jesus is reprimanding Judas and he's honoring her actions, which don't make any sense to me at all, what does she know that we don't? What are we missing? And that's the question that we need to get to the bottom of as we paint the picture, because we look at the portrait and I see the crowds outside and I see the disciples around the table, and I understand all of that. It all makes sense to me. And I see Judas kicked back and I know who he is and what he's going to do, and I hear his tone and his attitude, and that makes sense to me. And I see Jesus at the head of the table, and I understand that they're in a place of worship and they want to honor him because he just brought Lazarus back from the dead. And I get that. It makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is Mary laying on the floor pouring out perfume over Jesus' feet in a way that's almost sensual. That doesn't make sense to me. What does she know that we don't? What are we missing? And the more I spend time with this text and the more I look at it and dig deeply into it, I realize nothing. The answer is nothing. She doesn't know any more than anyone else there. She has seen Jesus perform the same miracles that everyone else has. She saw Lazarus be raised from the dead. She's probably, though they weren't traveling with Jesus and the disciples throughout the area over the past 3 years, she has heard those stories and she knows those men and she has talked with them, and they're good friends, she and Martha and Lazarus, with the disciples and all the group that follows, because there's a ragtag band of folks we learn from other writings that kind of tagged along with Jesus from time to time. But they've all become a pretty tight-knit community. What does she know that they don't? What is it about Mary's mindset? What is it about Mary? And that's the temptation for me. I don't think that Jesus is calling us, or that John is encouraging us to spend our lives laying at Jesus' feet on the floor, pouring out expensive perfume. Jesus says the poor will be with you always. It doesn't mean ignore them. He doesn't say you shouldn't do anything with the poor. He doesn't say you should ignore them completely. He says, I will not be with you always, so don't pass up the opportunity to have an authentic encounter with me when the opportunity presents itself. Don't let your pragmatism, don't let your sense of practicality rob you of those opportunities. And because we find ourselves so often not sitting in Mary's seat, but sitting at the seat of those disciples around the table in that picture, we find ourselves wanting to have that initial reaction of, what? When we see somebody do something that's a little bit uncomfortable, that causes us to be a little bit uncomfortable. And the best way that I can describe it is to take you back to Toronto with me, to Daybreak, to the L'Arche community. And we didn't really talk about what happens there. What it is, it's an international organization that provides opportunities for people who are severely mentally handicapped. And it provides them a safe place to live, a safe place to be loved. And what we often find there, and what Henri Nouwen found there, and what my friend Jeff found there in the time that he lived in that community, and just the few brief days that I spent there, was opportunity after opportunity after opportunity in profound awkwardness to see the true spirit of who Jesus is, born out of the lives of people who allowed themselves to be completely vulnerable. I don't ever want to be in a position where I look at myself in whatever portrait that I'm painting in my life at that time and find myself sitting at the table looking at someone who's being authentically engaged with Jesus and thinking, they shouldn't be doing that. I want to find myself sitting at the table watching someone encounter Jesus authentically. And I want to find myself in a position where I can relate. Because we talked about how sometimes in life we get so caught up in the details that we miss the significance of what's happening. I think sometimes in my life, I get so caught up in the details of what's happening that I forget the wonder of the moments that I'm tied up in. And it's not just big things like the birth of my kids or when family members die or when we participate in weddings. It's day-to-day things. It's the day-to-day things that remind us that Jesus is present and that God is real and that he is alive. And as we walk up to Easter and we begin this road through Passion Week to the point where Jesus dies on Friday, and we get on into the next week because we know the rest of the story. We know that Jesus dies on Friday, but it doesn't end there for us because we have the gift of hindsight, and we can look and we know that Jesus rises from the dead and that he comes back and that he spends time with his disciples again and he goes and he establishes a kingdom, and we have the rest of the story. We know that. And yet we find ourselves sitting at the table just doing what's practical. We find ourselves sitting at the table talking about ministry. And we find ourselves sitting at the table talking about needs. We find ourselves sitting at the table talking about our families. Things that are good and necessary and they need to happen, but we can't get stuck there. Sometimes we need to be a little bit more like Mary, and we need to find ourselves laying at the feet of Jesus, not because we want to spend all our time there, because if everybody spent all their time there, nothing else would get done, and that's not what Jesus has called us to. But in that moment, at that place, at that time, Mary looked at Jesus and she recognized him as God. She looked at him and she recognized him as someone to be worshiped. The memories of the last few weeks are flowing through her head, and she realizes he raised Lazarus from the dead. Can we just back up for just a brief second and say, what if we painted that picture today? What does that scene look like? What does that moment look like? This man who is here, who is walking around and he's been teaching, and yes, he's been claiming to be the Son of God. All those things we can deal with and we can digest and we can hold on to and we can say, yeah, this makes sense. Jesus has demonstrated mastery over death, and I don't care who you are or how strong your faith is or how old your faith is. That takes a little bit to digest. And Mary's trying to digest that in this moment, and she realizes that sitting around a table and talking is suddenly very trite, and it's suddenly very shallow, and it's very meaningless, and she knows nothing else to do except get the very best that she has and to pour it over Jesus' feet and to subject herself to him. That's where we want to be. Not all the time on the floor, not all the time at the table, but when we're at the table fully cognizant of what's going on the floor. And when we're on the floor fully cognizant of the fact that Jesus is the master over death. And that's what he's going to demonstrate here in his last works with Lazarus, and is what he's going to demonstrate here in the next week as we walk through Passion Week and as we get to Easter. It's an odd transition from Jesus' ministry, from his life, from the last 3 years of him walking and teaching and encountering and healing. It's an odd transition into then his final turn. What I'd like to do as we wrap this morning is take one quick look at a specific instance from the life of Henry. There was a young man named Adam who lived at the Daybreak community in Toronto, who was profoundly mentally handicapped, couldn't speak, couldn't move on his own, couldn't feed himself, couldn't wash himself, couldn't dress himself. And as Henry got plugged in there and began to spend more time in the community, they assigned him to Adam as his caretaker. That's the beauty of that place, is that everyone who's there as a resident has their own personal assistant, and the goal of that is to provide value to their lives, to demonstrate value to their lives, to show that they are valuable not only to their families and to their earthly community, but to God. It really is a beautiful place to go and just watch and learn and be really, really humbled. But Henry's experience with Adam, and he actually wrote a book about it after Adam passed away. But what it fully does is it's a full demonstration of someone who is sitting at the table in this picture that we've been painting today, and taking everything in and analyzing the full scope of what's happening and asking questions and try to systematically place everything. Who's doing what? And what does this mean? Because that was so much of what the disciples had talked about with Jesus, is what does this mean? What does this mean? You've said this, what does this mean? And you can read through the Gospels time and time again. They're asking, what does this mean? What does this mean? They want to make sense of it all. They want to understand. And what we see Jesus doing here in his interaction with Mary, and what we see Henry doing through his life with Adam and the time that he spent with Adam, was saying sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Sometimes we just be. Sometimes, Mary, we just need to be. Father, I thank you this morning for this short little snapshot into an episode that